everybody, and welcome to the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our studios, WGGS in Taylors, South Carolina. I am delighted to have back in the Meeting House today one of my favorite authors, because we share a deep love for the great C.S. Lewis. And I want to welcome Dr. Harry Lee Poe from his study on the campus of Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Welcome back to the Meeting House, Hal.
Thank you, Dwight. It's good to be back with you.
And you're here today because you've finished this 3-volume biography of C.S. Lewis. And we talked when you came out with the first volume entitled Becoming C.S. Lewis. And now the other 2 volumes are out, The Making of C.S. Lewis, which I read last year, and The Completion of C.S. Lewis, which is the newest volume out, each of them covering about 20 years of his life, if I've got that pegged right. I want to thank you for writing these books, Hal. I am a lover of C.S. Lewis, but you are that as well as a scholar of C.S. Lewis. I want to thank you for your work and thank you for your dedication to it. We may talk a little bit how you got into it, but the book itself, which you call The Completion of C.S. Lewis, what did you mean by this phrase, the completion?
Well, it's one thing to begin the race as a Christian. It's another thing to successfully complete the race. And in the epistles, there's always the challenge to continue to the race, and the idea that Christ has begun a good work in us that he will bring to completion. And you're not finished until you die. And so, in a real sense, Lewis died a good death. He was faithful unto death. And it's a good end to a story. Being a Christian doesn't mean you're free from troubles. And some of Lewis's greatest troubles came in those last years of his life, in his late middle age, and when he realized, oh my goodness, now I'm an old man.
Mm-hmm. Although he was only, 60?
He was just a week short of 65.
65, not as old as that used to be, certainly by our standards. You and I both are past that age. And yet, what kind of troubles did he have in this last third of his life?
Well, some things accelerated that had been going on. In his private life, he had been caring for the mother of one of his friends from Officer Training Corps in World War I. His friend died in the war, and Lewis committed to taking care of the mother until she died in 1951. And she was a difficult person, argumentative and headstrong and critical, judgmental, illogical, irrational, and highly demanding in her most vigorous days. But as she entered dementia and had a number of health problems herself, she created just chaos in the Lewis household. They couldn't keep help. They tried to have 2 maids at the house, and shared cooking and cleaning responsibilities. And they only lasted, a few months at a time before they would be run off. So she had difficulty with her. Then his brother Warney.
Wait a minute. Before you go on from Minto more, I want to pursue this a little bit. Early in my reading, and I think it was in the book God in the Dock, which is one of his first book of essays after he died, he had an essay on the reading of old books in which he discouraged his readers from reading secondary material and encouraged them to read primary material. You remember this.
Yes.
I made a commitment. I was a college student at the time. I made a commitment to read the primary material, and I don't think it was until the 1990s when I was called upon to teach a college course in C.S. Lewis that I began to read the secondary material. The thing is about it, when you read the primary material, there's nothing in the primary material about this situation which you've just described. It's not in his writings, is it?
Well, it's not in his published writings.
Yes.
But
In his letters, yes.
but primary materials includes something that is immediate. So a letter is a primary source that tells you exactly what was going on a particular day, what a person was thinking, what had been going on. A diary is primary material. Someone's memoir that they wrote 30 years later, once the memory has gotten just a little fuzzy, is a secondary source, even though it's by the person who actually had the experience.
Yes, you're right.
And so most of this information about what was going on at home is from Lewis's letters,
Right.
and from his brother's diary.
His brother's diary.
Warnie Lewis kept a diary all his life. And so it's a rich, rich source about what we know that C.S. Lewis was doing at any particular time and what was going on in the household.
And I didn't read, of course, the big volumes of letters did not come out, I don't think, until maybe after 2000. I'm not sure when they were published.
Yeah, 2004 is
Right.
when the first 2 volumes came out, and I think the 3rd volume came out in 2007. And these are over 1,000 pages long, each volume.
Each volume. And I hadn't read those. I had read very little of this, as you say, unpublished primary material. And when I began to read and realize this whole dramatic story of Minto Moore and what a pain she was to care for, and how little that seeped through his writings, I kept saying to myself, how could he be this wonderful a writer and have all of this strain and stress at home? I think it's one of the main things that you bring out in this volume 3, and that has deeply impressed me about Lewis.
Well, yes, and you have hints of it, oddly enough, in the Screwtape Letters. In the Screwtape Letters, Uncle Screwtape points out that the patient is in a strange relationship with his mother. And the mother has irritating habits, and she's always interrupting the patient, and the patient hates it. And in fact, this is what was going on with Lewis. He would try to be writing upstairs, and Mrs. Moore would call him, "Oh, come get my shawl," and then he'd bring her shawl, and then go back upstairs and start writing. And 10 minutes later, she'd say, "Oh, come fix me some tea." And then he'd stop and do that, and it was back and forth. We know this was going on because Warnie wrote about it, and it was driving Warnie crazy.
Yes, Warnie never liked the old woman.
He never liked Mrs. Moore.
He understood what a drain she was on Jack's life, but he could never get Jack really to deal with it in any other way. Well, talk to us about Warnie now. Jack,
now
C.S.
Warnie-
Lewis's brother, yeah.
Warnie was the older brother, and in childhood, Warnie had always looked after Jack. And though his name was Clive Staples Lewis, when he was a little boy, he decided his nickname would be Jack. So he's Jack Lewis to his friends and family. But as they grew up, and Warnie was in the Army, retired after slightly less than 20 years in the service, and had an Army pension, and lived into his 80s. So half his life he was retired. But Warnie sank deeper and deeper into alcoholism, and would have these long month-long binges, 2-month binges. He would go to a nursing home and dry out, and he realized he could avoid the nursing home if he would go to Ireland and do his drinking in
Yeah.
Ireland. And another thing he did in the late 30s, he had a cabin cruiser, and he would go up and down the rivers of central England along the Thames and the different streams that fed into it, and just go on a jolly holiday drinking gin. Um, and so he was always courteous. He was not a mean drunk, and he hid it well. He knew how to give the impression that he was um, uh, not drunk, even when he was drunk, and had no idea what you were saying, but he could smile pleasantly and nod his head and then collapse. But this put a huge strain on Jack right after World War II, just as Mrs. Moore was bedridden and required nursing care there in the home. Well, Jack was the one who had to do most of the nursing care. And so Warnie wasn't there to help, or Warnie was unhelpful or counterproductive. And that added great stress. And the expenses were stressful. So he had more expenses taking care of Mrs. Moore, and somebody had to pay the expenses to keep Warnie in a nursing home. So the home front was a highly stressful situation.
Well, today, tell me if I'm right, wouldn't we call this a dysfunctional family?
Oh, yes.
And we haven't even talked about Joy and her separation from her husband and all of that dysfunction that adds a third layer to it.
Yes.
All the while, Lewis being this celebrated around the world really as one of the great apologists for Christian living, and all this dysfunction going on all around him. It really is. You bring this out more, I think, and more clearly and more effectively than other biographers, and I do appreciate it.
Well, most of the biographies did not have access to all the letters.
That's right.
Or to the diaries of Warnie Lewis, and so I had the freedom to explore in a deeper way. And there's also a tradition that grew up about how you tell the story of Lewis, built mostly off of memoirs and remembrances of people and legends, things that just really weren't necessarily the case, but somebody tells a story and that somebody passes it on and it gets modified and changed a little bit. So I went back to the sources and just started fresh to see what I could find. But Lewis could not control his brother. He could not control Mrs. Moore, but he could exercise self-control himself. And so what he's trying his best to do is live out the New Testament model of what it means to be a Christian. And he's actively seeking in his own personal spiritual life to manifest the fruit of the Spirit and to combat the desires of the flesh.
Yes,
and one of the things the flesh really likes is to have a temper tantrum.
That is true, but at the same time, Hal, he was overeating, he was over smoking, and he was over drinking. And all of these things today we would say, well, this compromises his Christian discipleship, surely.
Well, it would today.
Yes.
It didn't then for several reasons. We've changed our beliefs about most of those things.
Yes, you're right.
During his day, smoking was thought to be a healthy thing because it dries out your lungs so you're not so susceptible to cold and flu. And we now know that's the worst thing you can do is dry out your lungs. We also now know that it causes heart disease and cancer. And in fact, Lewis suffered from heart disease. We also know that he got sick at the beginning of every term of the year. His students complained about this. He would go on a long walking trip every January in the snow and the hail and the sleet and the rain,
And come home
and come
sick.
back sick.
Yeah.
And then every Easter, on Easter vacation, he would go on a long 50-mile hike across England with his friend Owen Barfield and his crowd, and come back sick. And then every August, he'd do another long walk in Ireland with his friend Arthur Greaves and come back sick. He was prone to sickness, even when he was a child. His
Right.
mother worried about him. But anyway, he thought all of these things were helping him not be so sick. It's the change of medicine.
It is. It is.
And the drinking was, he wasn't an alcoholic, but he certainly did drink plenty. He thought it would make him healthier, keep his internal organs fit and in shape and functioning, his kidneys and his bladder and all of that. And of course, he wound up dying from the multiple intersection of heart disease and prostate, kidney, bowel failure. Not bowel, excuse me, bladder.
Bladder, you bring out all of this in your book, I think, again, more than I have read elsewhere, and I appreciate it. I want to ask you, I started reading Lewis. You and I are contemporaries. We started reading Lewis probably in college. I certainly did. But you became a serious student and a scholar of Lewis, and you ended up knowing everybody and going everywhere and running things. How did this happen, and what triggered this in your own life?
Well, it was accidental, actually. I didn't know about C.S. Lewis until I was in seminary.
Oh, really?
I found out about him when I was at Southern Seminary. I grew up Southern Baptist, and Baptists really didn't read anything except Sunday school board material, unless we got thrown into a Christian's college or something like that and came upon him. I went to the University of South Carolina, and which is not a Christian college. But at Southern Seminary, I was told, people talked about him, and I said, well, goodness. But I didn't actually read the Chronicles of Narnia until I was in my PhD program at Southern Seminary.
Did you have Richard Cunningham as a professor?
I did. He was one of my professors, and he was one of the very first scholars to do a scholarly treatment of Lewis's philosophy.
Right.
But he never offered a course on C.S. Lewis, and we knew he had something to do with Lewis, but he never talked about it. So I sort of found out about him on my own. My big interest was, how does the gospel answer the deep questions of culture and society? And what I discovered was Lewis had something to say about that. And over the years, I've written about 20 books now. And those early books, I found that Lewis had something to say about almost everything I was writing about. So he pops up in every book I had written. And in the late 90s, I did a book on Christian witness in a postmodern world. How does the gospel answer the questions that postmodernity is asking? And I was asked to lead a workshop for the C.S. Lewis Summer Institute in Oxford and Cambridge in 1998. And as a result of that, I was asked to serve on the board of the C.S. Lewis Foundation and to become the program director for the Summer Institute, which is a triennial program, still goes on. That's where I met Chuck Colson. Colson was delivering one of the addresses, and he sat in on my afternoon seminar. And I just started going deeper into Lewis and decided to offer a course on Lewis at Union University. And then there were some gaps I thought needed to be filled. One was the people who studied with Lewis, who had been his students. I wondered whatever became of them. Did Lewis have any impact on higher education through his students? We knew about his apologetics, but that wasn't what he did for a living. he was a Christian educator. Did his students do anything? And so I sought them out, and lo and behold, yes, they had a huge impact. One of his students, Derek Brewer, was the head of Emmanuel College in Cambridge University. Another one, Brown Patterson, was the dean at the University of the South in Sewanee. And on and on and on. They were major literary figures, major critics and scholars. And so I put together a little book in which they told their own story of their experience with Lewis.
Yes, you mentioned the book and some of these people in this volume 3, and much of that information was new to me as well. Of course, Hopper, you knew.
Yes, Walter Hooper. I got to know Walter because there was a controversy about whether or not Hooper had forged some Lewis documents.
Yes, I read
was,
that book.
Yes.
What was her name who wrote the book?
Linskog, Catherine Linskog.
I did. I've got the book and I
C.S.
read
Lewis
it.
hoax.
Yes.
And she accused Hooper of forging a number of stories and documents. Hooper had helped Lewis out the last summer of Lewis's life. Warney was off on a binge. Lewis couldn't do his correspondence. Hooper agreed to serve as his secretary to help with his correspondence that summer. Then he went back to Kentucky to finish his teaching contract at the University of Kentucky. In the meantime, Lewis died that November 22nd, 1963. Hooper then came back to Oxford to help out sorting things out to help Warney, and spent the rest of his life in Oxford, devoted himself to keeping Lewis's books in print, to editing his papers. Lewis wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of articles and published sermons and that sort of thing that were never collected into books. They just appeared in little obscure church magazines and newsletters and church newspapers. And so Hooper put all of that together. But Warney and Lewis, Jack, did not save anything. They were not pack rats. So as soon as Lewis was finished with the manuscript, he threw it away. So there are very few existing Lewis manuscripts. And when Warney was cleaning up, there was a bonfire. And he was just burning, all this old worthless paper from his brother's desk in his study. And Hooper said, "Please, can I have it?" And Warney said, "Well, I'm cleaning up. Anything you can take away today, you can have, but it has to go today. And so he hauled off some unfinished manuscript. The only reason they were there is because Lewis had not finished them. He would put something aside and work on it later. And Linskog accused Hooper of forging these documents. Now, as it happened, one of the men who contributed to my book, Alistair Fowler, who taught at the University of Edinburgh and was one of the most renowned Renaissance scholars of the last quarter of the 20th century, was Lewis's student, and they would exchange books they were working on. And they both liked science fiction, and Fowler had actually read these manuscripts back in the 1950s. So he mentioned that in his article for me. And so I wrote an article for Christianity Today, shedding more light on the Dark Tower. The Dark Tower was the name of this short story that was the centerpiece of the controversy. And as a result, Walter Hooper wrote a very nice long letter to me, thanking me for defending his reputation and setting the record straight in a public forum. And so we got to be friends after that.
If a person today wanted to jump into this river you've been swimming in, this C.S. Lewis this ocean of Lewis studies and writing and all of that. What would you, aside from reading Lewis's own stuff, what organization would you recommend, or what event would you encourage them to attend?
Well, there are several different kinds of things. For instance, Wheaton College outside of Chicago is the repository for a number of important papers and manuscripts and first editions of Lewis, and also Tolkien, Dorothy L. Sayers, a number of that circle. It's the Wade Center. They have their own building there at Wheaton College. And so this is a vital resource for anyone doing research into Lewis. They also have regular lectures, and they have a podcast. The directors there, a husband and wife team, David and Crystal Downing. David is an important Lewis scholar, and Crystal is probably the leading scholar on Dorothy L. Sayers. So that's one type of resource. Another type of resource would be the C.S. Lewis Foundation. They own the kilns in Headington outside of Oxford, where Lewis lived. They do a summer program where you can go for a week in residence and have an intensive experience. There's a major Lewis scholar who will lead the workshop, and then you go in the afternoon on tours. This summer, Don King, who's a very important Lewis scholar, is leading the program. And every 3 years, they go back to Oxford for a week-long program of seminars and plenary lectures. Then there's the C.S. Lewis Institute outside of Washington and also in Atlanta. And they have study programs, lectureships, sponsors special conferences. And all of these would have websites that your listeners could look at. Now, Don King and I sponsor the Inklings Fellowship. We have an annual retreat in Montreat, North Carolina. It's not really Montreat. Locally, they call it Montreat, but it's really Rivendell. And it's not really in the Smoky Mountains. It's in the Misty Mountains. And if you go to Montreat, but we're coming up next weekend to do that, and we'll focus on Tolkien next weekend. But we regularly look at Lewis, and every 3 years we go to Oxford for an Inklings Week in Oxford. So that's the Inklings Fellowship. We've got a website for that as well. Then there are local societies. The oldest is the New York C.S. Lewis Society, and they have regular meetings that you can now attend regardless of where you are in the world, because they now Zoom it. You had to, one time you had to be there, but now it's open to the world. And they've had a newsletter for years, and so they would be a very important group that has been a catalyst for decades. And there are a number of those around the country. There's one in Chattanooga. There's one in Memphis. The Memphis C.S. Lewis Society has monthly meetings. And so there are varieties of things. And then different organizations will, from time to time, have a special Lewis conference. The Presbyterians did at Montreat a few years ago and had over 600 people in attendance. The St. Philip's Anglican Cathedral in Charleston sponsored one earlier this year and had over 800 people in attendance. So people are interested in Lewis because he seems to speak to the issues of today, even though he died 60 years ago.
Yes, I'll have to tell you a story. I was the interim preacher for a church on St. Simon's Island back in '05, and I was at the church during the summer. I did a series of talks on C.S. Lewis, and somebody suggested that I should do a public talk. So they arranged for me to speak at the library, and on a Friday night in pouring rain, I went to give a simple talk on C.S. Lewis, and I'm telling you, it was standing room only. I was shocked. They had no idea who I was, of course, but just this interest in C.S. Lewis that still percolates all around. When I was a senior at Georgetown College in January of 1972, I spent the month in England, and I rented a car and went over to Wales and stopped in a very, very large used bookstore and bought every C.S. Lewis book they had. I have a whole collection of first editions of wonderful books. And of course, you may know that the used bookstore up in Hendersonville,
Stan Shelley.
yes, is I think kind of the chief clearinghouse worldwide on many of these books.
Well, Shelley and Son Books in
Yes.
Hendersonville is a premier source for people looking for books related to Lewis and the Inklings.
And the
all the
Inklings, yes.
And he regularly has not just first editions, but autographed by Lewis.
Yes,
And,
yes. I've been in there, talked with him, and seen his moving collection stuff coming and going all the time.
Well, he always brings a premier selection to our Inklings Week in Montreat.
Yes, he told me about it. Yeah,
And he always does a good business. He's
That's
got
great.
wonderful things because he goes to England. He ferrets out things. He looks for estate sales that most of us wouldn't have access to, and is able to buy things that the average person could not find. And he works hard at that. And,
I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you one more story. When I was living in Jerusalem, they had a fire at the Narkis Street Baptist Church in West Jerusalem. And after the fire, they sold a lot of their books. And I bought a Hebrew translation of his book. I think it was the book on miracles that had been translated into Hebrew. Now, it was not damaged, but I bought it, but then later traded it to a collector in Louisville, Kentucky for two pieces. One was a Socratic Club poster, and the other was the famous picture of Lewis, a print of Lewis, where he was holding a cigarette in his finger, but it had been airbrushed out. So it could sell in modern evangelical America. But anyway, I still got those two.
So you have a Socratic Club poster.
I do have a Socratic Club poster.
Oh, those are very rare.
Yes, and plus a nice collection of first edition books, which I bought in 1972. Well, this has been great. We could talk for a long time. Harry Lee Poe, Union University, C.S. Lewis scholar, thank you for being in the meeting house again today. We must do this again, and to keep alive both of our interest in the great Jack Lewis.
Thank you, Dwight. It's been great being with you again.
This is Dwight Moody in the meeting house, where we've had a great conversation on religion and American life. Visit our website. I have reviewed all of 3 volumes of Hal Poe's 3-volume biography of C.S. Lewis, and you'll find that at themeetinghouse.net. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.